Hi, friends, and welcome to Season 3 of the School Librarian Learning Network podcast. I'm Steve Tetreault, often known as Dr. T Loves Books, and I love talking about all things related to school libraries. I'm an old dog who's always trying to learn new tricks. That's why in each episode of the SLLN podcast, I'll chat with a school librarian about a lesson, program, or activity they love. Hopefully, this can be a place for school librarians to get ideas and find new ways to engage with their students and staff. Speaking of which, I'd love to hear about what you and your friends are doing in your school library. Email me at drtlovesbooks@gmail.com. That's drtlovesbooks@gmail.com to tell me about what you're doing, offer feedback about the SLLN podcast, or to request a podcast sticker. As Amy Herman likes to say, being a guest on a podcast is a great way to show your admins you are engaged in meaningful professional development and leadership in the profession. So drop me a line and let's chat. That being said, the opinions and ideas shared in this podcast by myself and my guests are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. I just like to geek out about school libraries. So without further ado, let's get to this week's episode. Hey everybody, we're back, and one of the great things about having a podcast is that you can kind of do whatever you want to do, and I'm doing something a little different this week. I'm going to talk to myself, and I don't know if you know this, but I am a pretty big AI skeptic. I think that AI has really jumped the gun, and that when we are pushing it into schools, we're making some mistakes. And so I have talked about this before. I actually talked about it during the CALC virtual conference. I've talked about it at a couple of different conferences in different places. And I wanted to throw this out there as an episode. Now, usually we only do audio, but there's also a video going to be available for this one. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. It'll be on YouTube. I'll put the link in the show notes. But I wanted to share some ideas and information about why it's important for us to be Luddites. And I think it's incredibly important that we think about we as being school librarians, but also educators. I think we really need to be Luddites. And B, we need to know what Luddites are. So let's kind of walk through some of this. All the slides that I'm going to use and talk about are available online. There's a link, bit.ly/edtechluddite with a capital E, a capital T, and a capital L, edtech Luddite. So you can check those slides out, and they are available with a Creative Commons license. So you are welcome to find them, use them, remix them, as long as you are giving credit and you are not trying to make money off of them, and you offer your slides with the share alike that I am offering mine. You are more than welcome to grab my slides, use them, and rearrange them as you see fit, or change them into something else. So I think most of you know, but just if you don't, let me give a quick rundown. So I have been a school librarian since 2022. And before that, I was a hobbyist librarian starting around 2016, which is when I started my school library program. And that's where I kind of came to realize how important school librarianship was. Before that, I was an ELA teacher starting in 1998, so I've been around the block a bit. I've got a couple of different degrees in educational administration and supervision. I've got my master's and my doctorate in that. I've also got my master's in information science, which is when I got my school library degree. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from educationally. And then in my technology journey, I actually started out using technology quite a bit in my practice as an educator. In 1999, I was, if not the first person in the district to use email, the first one to offer it to parents and students to contact me. I think I'm the reason that we had an email policy in my district in the first place. So after that, I was very much on board with what can we use technology for that's going to make education better for our students. And so I was one of the ones who agitated to get Google Apps for Education into our school. Back in the way early days. I did my dissertation for my educational administration degree on how Google Docs was being used in schools and what were things that were holding back its use. Because by 2014, when I did my doctorate, even before then, when I was getting started with this, I was like, why is this not something that's used more widely? So I dug into that a bit. In 2015, I was a technology coach in my district. As a school librarian, I have done 10-minute tech lessons with my students. And in 2024, I contributed a chapter to a book called We Can Teach That. And my chapter was called From Digital Natives to Digital Awareness, because I think it's really important that we think about technology literacy with our students. All of that kind of combined. And also in 2024, I wrote a piece for Knowledge Quest about should we pump the brakes on AI in education? Because I was already starting to feel a little, I don't know about this. And that all kind of led to a chapter in a book called Radical School Librarianship, edited by Judy Morellin. And in I wrote chapter 8 for that, why schools librarians should be Luddites. And that has led to some interesting conversations and discussions and debates. And so I wanted to share some of the thoughts that went into that chapter here because I think it's really important that we think very carefully about how we're using AI ourselves as practitioners and professionals and educators and how we're introducing our students to it. So to get to that, I want to backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about the rise of different kinds of technology in education. So in the 60s through the 80s, we started to see the use of calculators, electronic calculators, because they really didn't become financially viable as a product that schools could purchase on a reasonable basis until really the 60s, 70s, almost the 80s, when they were really starting to get cheap enough to use them whenever we wanted. And the problem that some people saw was that solving equations by hand takes a lot of time. And one of the things we don't have a lot of in school is time. So this solution of the digital calculator was seen as this is something we should really think about. This is something we should implement because it's going to save time and it's relatively inexpensive by the time we get to the 80s. And they're really not widely adopted into schools until the 80s when there's a real push to try and get students to use them, especially on testing. And the thing is, we use calculators now all the time. We don't really think anything about it for the most part, but this was a real upset in the educational world when we started bringing in these calculators to do math for students. And there was a lot of controversy about it. So we may not remember that. I grew up just using calculators because they were there. But in educational circles, there was a pushback against this idea of why are we taking math skills out of students' minds and out of students' hands? And we've kind of since moved on from that a bit, although the pendulum may be swinging on that. During the 70s and 80s, we start to see computers, personal computers, getting cheap enough that they actually kind of make financial sense. And we see them starting to be used in a lot of different places. And so we start to see this push for, well, if they're out in the world, maybe we students should be learning how to use them, right? So maybe you remember Oregon Trail, Chisholm Trail. You've died of dysentery by playing this game. It was in the 70s, in the 80s, that was the thing. I remember we had a computer lab in my school and we would go and learn how to do like a little bit of basic programming. We'd use them for some basic computer gaming so we could understand some of the functions and possibilities that computers offered. The thing is, in the 70s and 80s, there wasn't really a problem that was being addressed by this technology. And so there wasn't really a widespread adoption of computers in the 70s and 80s. Playing games was sort of a novelty. The computers were still relatively expensive, and so they weren't really adopted into education at this point, although we start to see them being used in the business world. And the more they're used in the business world, the more we start to see them slowly get dribbled into schools. And so in the 80s through the 2000s, we start to see some problems arising that are kind of drifting over from the business world, right? We see that essay writing takes a long time and presentations require lots of materials. But in the business world, we're starting to see that computers are being used, software is being used to deal with both of these issues. Word processing makes writing go faster. Slide decks makes presentation creation a lot easier. Computers have gotten less expensive. Software has gotten less expensive. So as we're starting to see that the technology has gotten less expensive and that is being used more widely, that's when we start to see a push to get it used in schools. And sort of the argument is efficiency. And sort of the argument is, well, since they're being used in these other places that students are eventually going to go into, why don't we get them prepared? So that's when we start to see software and computers, computer labs, not so much carts, but labs tend to spring up in the 80s through the 2000s. And then through the 90s into the 2020s, we're seeing that now students can produce work faster and businesses can produce work faster. And now we've got a bottleneck at not the production level, but at the information gathering level. Accessing information takes a lot of time. Going to the library, finding the right books, making sure your library has the right books, right? So there's this push toward more efficiency, push toward finding more time in the school day. And that's when we start to see this thing called the internet that has been sort of slowly percolating through our work world and through just sort of the general consciousness. And people start to say, well, this is an opportunity, or this is a tool that can provide this opportunity for faster access to information. And it's relatively inexpensive. It's still pretty expensive, and access is way slower than we think of it now, but way faster than we would have had just going to the library. So we start to see this push to get internet brought into schools in the 90s and through the 2020s. And it did take almost 30 years for internet to be really a readily available resource in schools. And there's still some schools that, since the pandemic, we've seen this kind of pushed to the background. But for a long time, there were schools who just didn't have internet. It was too hard to get. And when this was going on, when they were bringing technology, bringing this level of technology, bringing the internet into schools, there were debates about, should we be doing this? Are we helping students by bringing this in? And there were a lot of back and forth conversations about whether we should be doing this. And obviously the trend went toward, yes, we are going to do this. So in the 2010s through the 2020s, now we've got some software, we've got some computers, we've got some access, but now we don't have enough access. Computer labs there's only so many computers, and there's way more students than there are computers in the labs. So now we start to see a push for, well, we've got all these applications and we've got all these devices, but it takes so much time to get to the lab. It takes so much time to boot up a computer. I don't know how many of you out there are from my age group where booting up a computer took minutes at a time. Like, you would be talking a significant percentage of your class time was spent just starting a computer up and then shutting it back down at the end of class. So all of this is going on. And so while we've got better access via computers, we've got faster production via computers, we've got better access via the internet, it still takes a lot of time. And so to push back on that time restraint, we start to see cloud-based software. We start to see minimal app start times. We start to see machines like Chromebooks that boot up in about 30 seconds. And that was really one of the huge selling points of Chromebooks, that they booted up in 30 seconds and you didn't have to wait minutes and minutes and minutes. And all of this is being done in devices that are getting less and less expensive. So as the cost has dropped, and the speed has increased, we're seeing wider and wider adaptation of this. And so there's this efficiency push in schools. It's less expensive, so it's more efficient. It takes less time, so it's more efficient. And we're pushing efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. And we're only now starting to see we did see some back in the day, but it's really more recently that we're starting to see a lot of pushback against this idea of making things as efficient as possible. Because when we do something that is really efficient, when we create a system that's really efficient, we take out so much of the friction that is involved in creating and in learning. And there's actually a need for some friction in the learning process. Friction helps things stick. And so we're starting to see a pushback against technology. And in fact, more and more studies are showing that analog actually sinks into our brains way better than digital in many, many different ways, many, many different reflections, many, many different iterations. So all that's going on. And then we get the pandemic. And the pandemic hits, and we start to see this, just everybody's using technology. And that helps to accelerate the next step, which is the introduction of AI. And artificial intelligence, you can talk about it in a lot of different ways. General AI, some people talk about spell check as being AI. I don't know. I think AI is a little more complex than that. But ChatGPT launches in November of 2022. That was not quite 4 years ago that technology began. And in almost no time, it was spreading like wildfire. People were amazed at what this stuff could do. And it's unfortunate that we have been jumping onto this wagon train of, well, it's inevitable, so we have to do it. And so I think we need to really step back and think carefully about what AI is and what it isn't. So AI is used to market a lot of different tools and technologies. And it's important to realize that artificial intelligence, that phrase, AI, artificial intelligence, that is a marketing term. It is not a statement of the product contents or abilities. Because here's the thing, AI, artificial intelligence, isn't always artificial. There are companies who have started quote unquote AI companies that offer their services through AI that actually are just people looking up information. And so that's something that we want to be aware of. And in terms of it being intelligent, it absolutely is not intelligent. I'm sure you've seen the stories about AI suggests using glue for your pizza or eating rocks to up your mineral intake. We see that AI gives out wrong information on almost on a par with how often it gives out right information. And especially when it comes to different kinds of mental health information, it gives out terrible information half the time, literally half the time. That's a big problem. It is not intelligent. And so this marketing term, AI, people are so amazed and impressed. Oh, we've got this thing that can think for us. But the fact of the matter is, it's getting pushed into schools, but I don't think it should be, because we're not really thinking through all of the cons that are supposedly outweighed by the pros that people are throwing out there. I would argue that there's not nearly as many pros as there are cons, and that there are a lot of arguments that are being made in, I think, either bad faith or based on misinformed opinions. And so I think we need to think very carefully, because so many schools are buying into AI systems and pushing their students into AI courses. There are colleges that are starting up AI divisions for their students to take part in. We've got schools from K through 12 pushing lessons on students using AI. And I think that is a big mistake. And I think we're going to really regret it if we go down that path. And I think educators buying into using AI to increase their own productivity, I think are missing out on a lot of things too. So I think we need to look a little bit at, having seen sort of the evolution of ed tech and how it sort of started with stuff that was really more in the private sector and slowly made its way into schools. There were a couple of things that you may have noticed when we were going through that earlier history. And the thing is, a lot of that earlier technology was pulled into schools by educators. Educators are the ones seeing how this stuff was being used in other spheres, seeing how computers are being used, seeing how software is being used. And educators are the ones from the bottom up pulling those technologies into schools. And I think AI is actually going about it almost the opposite way, where we see people pushing AI into schools and saying, you have to use this, because if you don't, students aren't going to be prepared. And I think that is very misleading. And I think it is very different than what we've seen in the past, this push versus being pulled in naturally by educators. I think there's also a big difference in organic adaptation, adoption rather, versus artificial adoption. Because again, when teachers are seeing like, oh, I used this typing program to help me get more work done on my own, and I can see how my students would benefit from that. That's an organic way of teachers bringing something into the classroom and seeing a benefit for it. AI seems to be going the opposite way, where people are saying, well, here's a thing that exists and you have to learn how to use it so you can teach our students how to use it, because it's going to be incredibly important. That's incredibly artificial. There has not been a lot of use cases where people have said, oh, look at all this awesome stuff that AI is doing to make things better. I want to bring that into my students. No, it's the opposite. It's people saying AI is going to change your world, so learn how to use it and force your students how to use it, and you better get on board with this. And that is a very different thing than what we've seen in the past with educational technology. The other thing we've seen is that in the past, technology takes decades, years at least, decades usually, to really get fully brought into use in schools. And those decades involve lots of research and lots of study and lots of people looking at, how is this technology affecting our students? How is it being used? And what are the potential benefits or drawbacks? Whereas AI, from the time it was released to the public in November 2022 to less than 4 years later now, and it's being just jammed into every crevice that we can find in both education and in the wider world, that is not a slow and measured rollout. That is not the adoption of things that are working well and being brought in. That is outside forces pushing this tool. And those outside forces are the ones who make money when people use the tool. So of course they're going to want to push it. Of course they're going to want to get it out there. The other thing that is a little different about how AI is being used is the fact that just the time it takes to get it into a school or get it into regular use. When I was going through my educational administration courses, I had a professor who would talk about how education is like a battleship. And if you want to change its course, it takes a long time, a lot of energy, and it's just not an easy thing to do. And that used to drive me nuts. It used to chafe because I was this young go-getter who wanted to change everything and like, look at this problem. Why can't we just fix that? And so the long time it took to make changes to the education process, the education system, the education structure, that was very frustrating to me. But now, being a little older, maybe a little wiser, I don't know, but certainly looking back at how we have seen things come into education in the past and looking at how AI is being pushed real hard, I think there's something to be said for taking time, because we are talking about implementing things into a system that is meant to literally shape the future of our students, shape their lives, shape how they interact with the world, and shape the world based on how they interact with it. So I think there's something to be said for having some caution, for taking some time and trying to think things through carefully. There's probably reasons why we want to slow things down in education. Now, AI, we've seen a lot of different educator impacts. We've seen that there are a lot of different things that are going on with it. And as we start looking at some of the drawbacks, there are so many issues. And so let's talk about some of those issues. We're starting to see educators noticing that students are using AI and that seems to be impacting the way students are able to think, like literally the way students are able to think. And we're seeing that our students may be getting not only their education undercut by this tool that is doing thinking for them or replacing their thinking, but it also might be undercutting their emotional well-being. And there's a lot of information and reports and studies that are showing that students interacting with AI is harmful to them in multiple ways, not just educationally, but in terms of their emotional and mental health. So we're seeing that as educators in our students. We're starting to see very different kinds of students than we used to have. We're also seeing, as librarians, some specific impacts, because as librarians, one of the things we should be thinking carefully about is, where is information coming from? And AI is built on breaking, completely destroying copyright ideas. And that's something that as librarians, we're supposed to be aware of the ethical use and the responsible use of information. AI is not ethical. It's not moral. It's not responsible. It's not legal when you look at the bare bones of it. It's also really driving a lack of trust in information, because AI creates things that seem real, and it's very easy for people to point to AI produced information and say, well, I don't know if that's real or not, or point to real information, say, I don't know if that's AI or not. And that's a problem. It's undermining people's trust in information itself. And as purveyors of information, we need to think carefully about what impact this tool is having on the information landscape, because it's really messing up the information ecosystem. So I think it's only rational, with those things in mind, that any kind of technology we look at should elicit in us a Luddite response. And a lot of times people think they hear the word Luddite and they hear it as an insult, or they hear it as a piece of information that maybe they don't have the full picture of, because Luddites are often seen as the people who went around smashing machines and they hated technology. People tend to think of a Luddite as someone who hates technology. And that is not really the case, which we'll talk about in a second. But the Luddite movement is named after a person named Ned Ludd, who may have been fictional, but he was the leader of this movement. And the Luddites, the group that kind of formed around this Ned Ludd character, were going out and they were smashing technology in certain instances. But there was a reason for that. They weren't just doing it because they wanted to cause chaos and confusion. There were reasons behind why the Luddites did what they did. And the story of the Luddites has really been glossed over quite a bit. And it's interesting because it's one of those situations, I think, where history has been written by those with the ability to chronicle it and the desire to perpetuate it. And so the Luddites enemies are the ones who really were controlling the story of what Luddism was for the longest time. Because Luddites actually, this is not just me making this up, you can go and check this out, but Luddites were people who were familiar with technology. They were the ones who actually were on the cutting edge of a lot of technology during the Industrial Revolution. And they were very concerned with the impacts technology were going to have, not just on themselves, but on vulnerable populations. Because a lot of the technology that was being brought in during the Industrial Revolution was being used by manufacturers, by the owners of companies, by the rich, the elite, to drive further profits at the expense of the health, the safety, the financial security of the workers. They were trying to replace people. And when you look at AI, it's hard not to see a comparison there. But you can check out more information about this. There's a couple of links here that go to further info because it's a really fascinating story. But a Luddite really is a person who is familiar with technology. They understand how the technology works, why it does what it does. They think about the impacts that that technology has. And then they make a decision based on whether that technology adds more than it takes away from society and from the people that it's going to affect. So as librarians, as school librarians, we are often the tip of the educational technology spear. We are often the ones who are at the forefront of technologies. And sometimes that's because we are the ones who are sort of seeing different tools that pop up and we're trying them out. And we're seeing things that, oh, that's cool. We should bring that into school. And sometimes it's because our school says we're going to do this new technology. And school librarians often end up being the people who learn the most about it the fastest so that they can help educate other people in the district. So as those folks who are at the front line, we discover things that are new and we learn about them and we figure out, well, how are they built and what does it do? And we try to find use cases because there's a lot of technology out there that doesn't really apply to schools. If we find those use cases, then we dig into its safety and security, or we should be digging into its safety and security and thinking about, is this something that's safe for our students to use? Is it something that's safe for our staff to use? And then if we come to positive conclusions on all of those things, then we help introduce it to students and staff, right? That's what we should be doing. That's how things should be working. And the thing is with AI, when you start looking at the safety, the security, how it's built, why it's built, what it's built on, you very quickly start to see there are a lot of issues beyond that thin veneer of look at all the things it can do for you. And I've broken it down into 10 different categories, but there's more. And this is just a sampling of some of the things we need to think about. So let's go through some of the issues that I have seen with technology, with AI particularly. And I'm using AI as an example because it's being pushed so hard, but I think this is something we need to think about for any technology we come across. AI just happens to be the technology du jour. So let's look at the educational issues and impacts of AI. So we are starting to see that there are things like cognitive debt that build up. That basically means when you use AI to find information or when you use AI to create something, your brain is less likely to latch on to the information AI provides than if your brain does the hard work itself, because your brain's not doing the hard work. And so that hard work that makes things stick in our brain is absent. So we are, in using AI, people who use it are less likely to remember the things that they are using AI for. That's a bit of a problem in education. We also get this issue of cognitive offloading, which is basically when you are using AI, you are undercutting your own processes of learning. You are undercutting your skills and knowledge. And so later on, you are less able to learn because you have used AI to basically short circuit and jump over a whole bunch of steps in the learning process. So that cognitive offloading, our brains are not, when people are using AI, their brains are not learning how to learn. They're not learning how to think. And so they are losing grit. They're losing stamina. They are losing their ability to process and critically think. So these are issues in education. And I think those alone should disqualify the use of AI in schools. But there's more than that too, because if you haven't looked at the legality of AI, you really need to. The basic idea of how AI is built is, okay, I'm going to start an AI company. So I'm going to go out and find, beg, steal as much information as I can to train my AI model. And that basically is the business model of AI companies. I'm going to steal a bunch of stuff from others and I'm going to sell what I have stolen. That's kind of what it comes down to. There are AI copyright lawsuits all over the place. There are settlements being reached because these AI companies know that if they go to court, they're going to lose billions. They're going to lose more than they are worth. And so they can't. And these companies are saying, yeah, but if we don't steal information, if we don't take this copyrighted information, we can't create our product, which to me seems like a real good case of your business model doesn't work. If you are saying you can't do your business unless you steal, then you don't have a business. You have some sort of illegal enterprise. So when these companies are ingesting all of these copyrighted materials, they're doing it fully aware that they are breaking the law because they are using copyrighted materials. There's some people who say, well, but they're not really using the copyrighted materials because AI is going to remix it and blend it. It doesn't matter. They are taking stuff that is not theirs and using it in a way that is not intended to be used so that they can reproduce those patterns and systems and information. That's breaking copyright. There's also a moral issue with AI because a lot of copyrighted materials used to train AI models, but also lots of companies are scraping the internet to pull publicly available information into these huge data sets. That means that they're looking at your social media posts. They're looking at your documents that you share online, your videos that you share online. They're taking all of that and pushing it into their models and using it to train these AI models. Most people don't know that their information is being used that way. A lot of people don't want their information to be used that way. And companies are now starting to build in more and more terms of use that say, if you use our system, you are saying we can use your whatever you share for training AI. And that's not something you can really get around. Like if everybody you know is on Instagram and Instagram builds that into their terms, your choices are don't use Instagram or allow Instagram to use your posts to train AI. That's not a great set of choices, but that's kind of where we're at. And so these companies know most people may not be aware that their information is being used or may not want their information to be used, but they're using it anyway. And that's immoral. I mean, they are aware that this is something that people don't want, but they are continuing to do it regardless. So we've got to think carefully about this tool that is drawing both illegally and immorally from data sources that they probably shouldn't be. So you also might want to, as a general practice, think about, have I looked at the terms and conditions of the tools I use recently? You may have noticed that every so often you get an email saying we're updating our terms of service. I would be willing to bet a whole lot of money that if you look at your last couple of years worth of emails on updates to terms of service, that you're going to see that they are saying you are allowing us to use your information for AI training purposes, whether it's publicly or privately used. If you're using our service, if you're not paying for it, and sometimes even if you are paying for it, we're going to use your information to train AI. So there's also an ethical issue to consider because AI is acting unethically in that it is creating incorrect information that looks correct. And it is it's really messing up the information ecosystem. It's messing up the information landscape. It's doing this. There are companies now. I just saw an article yesterday that was a company bragging that they can create fake historical videos that are so well done that you can't tell the difference between a real historical video and a fake historical video. What would be the purpose of that? There's not a whole lot of uses outside of entertainment to create something like that. All that's doing is sowing confusion. That is unethical. It is not okay to use a tool to make it harder for people to find good information, true information, correct and reliable information. And yet, that's what AI is doing. And sometimes these AI models are purposely, deliberately lying in the information that they pump out. that they know that there is something that is not correct, and they're putting out that incorrect information anyway. So this is a big problem, and it's completely unethical. And yet, we're seeing these AI tools being pushed as something we should be using and learning about. And the thing is, when you start looking at, well, why are people doing these things? Well, a lot of times it's because AI companies are making their tools available for free for a certain amount of use. And in fact, ChatGPT allowed college students to use their tools to study for midterms and finals. And they're not doing that because they want to be friendly and helpful and help students. No, they're getting people hooked on their product. The first taste is free, and then you got to pay. Their AI companies are not putting these models out in the world. They're not putting these tools out in the world because they think they're going to make the world better. They're putting them out in the world because they make money. That's what they want. They are trying to make money. The CEO of a company that sells dog poop says dog poop is the future. Of course, right? AI companies are going to say, oh, AI is great. AI is wonderful. That's because they get paid when you use it. So think about where the messages to use AI are coming from, and think about, is there any money involved? Because it's something that they're counting on. There's also other ethical issues to consider with AI, and I didn't create this. Per Axbaum put this together, but it's elements of AI ethics. And there are so many things to consider here that impact the ethics of AI use that we don't think about a whole lot. There's this imagined harm that AI is going to kill us all, which may not be as imagined as we move further and further into this, but is at this point an imagined harm. But there are actual real harms occurring because of AI. And this has been out for years now. This is not something that's brand new. It gets updated every so often. You might want to check it out. There's also environmental impacts of AI. Using AI uses water and electricity in massive amounts. And I'm sure by now you've seen some of the stories about how AI data centers are using massive amounts of water and electricity, and they're causing electricity prices to go up. They're using water, and they're using potable water. They're using the stuff we drink to cool the computers. Once it's gone through the systems, it's not potable anymore. There are, I think it was Meta, was just found to be polluting a huge public water utility by pumping stuff they've used in their computers back into the system and causing massive harms in the town that this is happening to. And at a time when water is getting more and more scarce, fresh water is getting more and more scarce, and you can check that out. That's a whole scary issue on its own. But we're finding out that these companies are using millions of gallons of water. We're seeing that they're using massive amounts of electricity. And one of the most disturbing elements of this is that so many of these environmental harms are being pushed onto the most vulnerable populations and the populations least able to push back in a sort of environmental racism. And there's a rapper, vocalist called SZA, and she, or SZA, I'm honestly not sure, but she called out the fact that so much of what AI is doing, the harms are being concentrated in often Black areas. And that's, I mean, we've already got issues of all the pollution that happens, the environmental racism that goes on in running highways through minority areas, but AI is taking this to a whole other level. And so we may not personally feel the effects, but there are people who are feeling the effects of this, and we should not be okay with that. And there are now larger and larger groups that are feeling the effects of this. I'm sure you've started to see stories are popping up about data centers that have opened in near people's homes, and they produce these horrible noises, this noise pollution that is driving people crazy. So they're not only using resources that are very difficult to replace or driving up costs of resources that we need, they're also creating harms that are both environmental and mental, right? So we want to give some thought to, how is the new technology impacting the world around us? And is the impact worth the trade-off? And I don't know that the impact is worth what we get out of it. On top of all of that, there are psychological impacts that AI is having. There have been some real disturbing news reports about how AI is impacting especially children's mental health. There are bots that have had quote unquote sensual chats with kids. We know that AI offers incorrect information. And for children, especially, but for any human being, it can be really difficult to tell what's good information, what's bad information. While we might be trained in trying to ferret out how to do that, not everybody is. And so it can be incredibly harmful to people. We're seeing that AI actually can drive AI psychosis, that it will reinforce people's delusions because AI is set up so that it is supposed to it is built to be sycophantic. It's built to say yes to you. And so if someone with mental health issues, delusions, goes to AI and starts talking about the delusions, AI is going to reinforce those delusions. It's going to say, yes, you're absolutely right. That's a problem. That's a major problem, especially for people who have mental health issues and teenagers in particular. We also see that AI has been accused of leading to suicides, that it has reinforced people's suicidal ideation, suicidal tendencies. That's a real problem. How can we be thinking that this is a tool we should bring into schools when there are actual physical harms it is causing to people? So we need to think carefully about that. There's also privacy and security issues. When we are thinking about AI, sorry, I've got all these links in here. Let me get around that. So when we're thinking about AI, we may not realize that it actually keeps records of the information that it gets from its users. It keeps chat logs. It keeps records of your name, your location. It keeps records of what you've done in it. It keeps records of what you've created with it. And those stacks and stacks of information often get pushed back into the system as further training data, but they're also out there and they exist. And sometimes they are open to public use. They are open to public searching. So we need to think really carefully about, are we giving AI information about our students? Because I don't care what kind of protections people say AI have built around it. It's COPPA compliant, it's FERPA compliant. That's only true up to a specific point, because there are lots of AI tools that have started, people have found ways to access, to get around their safeguards and to access the information that the AI models are keeping about their interactions. And if our students are having interactions with those models, those interactions are stored somewhere. That's not okay. If we as practitioners are feeding information into AI models about our students, confidential information, scores, identifier information, that's potentially a real serious issue of privacy and security, because those models, literally, people don't know how they work often. And so how do we know if the information that's inside them is being held securely and safely? Is it something that can be, its guardrails can be gotten around? So that's something we really need to consider. There are also economic impacts of AI. And it's funny, there are lots of companies that let go their employees in the idea that they were going to save a lot of money by having an AI tool do the job of employees. Except now a lot of those companies are finding that they have to rehire humans because AI models are not very good at doing the jobs of humans. So they thought they were going to save money, and instead they're losing money because they spent money on these tools, and now they've got to rehire people to replace the tools that they spent money on. This is not a rare thing. It's, I don't have the actual statistic in front of me, but it is a very large percentage of companies that have laid people off to replace them with AI are now bringing back humans. And those costs, those are problems because that cost is going to get passed on to consumers at some point. Companies aren't just going to eat it and say, oh, well, we made a mistake. Also, we mentioned before that electricity use and water use are soaring with the creation of these data centers that AI relies on. Those costs are getting passed on to consumers. Electricity costs are going up by huge amounts. Water costs are starting to go up. Water scarcity is becoming an issue. So these are economic impacts that AI is having that we often just skate right past. And one of the things that I find sort of funny and sort of disturbing is, I have a friend who works in publishing, and she was talking about how her company brought in AI to keep track of different elements of what she was working on in publishing. And it was very clear to her that they were asking her to train the AI to take her job. But she found that as she thought about it, the company was paying to have this AI tool, and the company was paying the employees to train the AI. So they're paying the AI company to create AI models that the company can then use to replace the employees. They're paying to be replaced. The companies are paying the companies using AI to replace their employees are paying the AI companies, and those AI companies are basically getting paid twice in that they are offering a basic model that then has to be trained by employees. And now the AI company has a model that has been trained and they can resell that product. It's absolutely mind-bending to me that businesses are going for this, and yet they are. And that's having some serious impacts on employment, but also on prices and costs of goods and services. So, on top of all of that, there are also some philosophical issues around AI use. And one of the things that I find very disturbing is the fact that companies are building these AI models, and when you build an AI model, it basically creates a black box. They start it on a training path, and then they kind of close up the box and they let it train itself up to whatever levels. That means that there's people who, not people, there are people who are building AI who don't know actually exactly how their AI works, how it's built, how it does exactly what it does. That's why it's so hard to build guardrails into AI models. You're going to see frequently that companies will say, oh, we built these guardrails in, and then a week later you'll see, oh, somebody broke those guardrails by using these kind of prompts, because AI is resistant to guardrails. It's resistant to, you can't go in and just change this line of code so it doesn't do this thing anymore. That's not how AI works. A lot of it is self-assembly. That's a problem. We don't know how it works. And the other problem is, not only do we not really know exactly how it works and we can't go in and fine tune and tweak it, the other problem I have with AI is it's built to generate statistically correct responses. AI is not smart. It is not intelligent. It doesn't know what it's saying. It doesn't know what it's doing. It basically looks at, here's a whole bunch of information. And when I am asked something, I can look through all this information and connect dots. And this is the most likely response that would follow the question that I was asked. It's not creating something brand new. It's creating an average. It's creating a statistically correct answer. That doesn't mean it's a correct answer. It just means that computer sees numbers add up to a certain percentage that should be something that looks like a right answer. And those answers often sound correct, but they're not necessarily correct. And they're also basically average. The answers are averages of other things. And so when people use computers, when they use AI rather, to be creative, to create new tools, new materials, new art, what they're really doing is they're creating an average product based on the work of other people. It's not new, it's not creative, it's not inventive, it's just an average. What is that driving us toward? Is that going to lead us to just massive mediocrity? Is it going to lead us to all having the basic same ideas, information, starting points? That's not necessarily great. We need difference. We need imagination. We need creativity. And that's not what AI is. There's also in AI a massive racism and bias issue that often gets neglected. And there are stories on stories on stories of how AI has displayed bias, displayed racism, even when information is fed into AI that contains no personally identifying information, it often will be racist. It's amazing. When you ask AI about certain things, they are trying to build guardrails in to prevent this, but you can ask AI about racism and bias and get it to push answers in a particular direction. And often those answers are going to be racist. They're going to be built on racist stereotypes, even after anti-racism training, as we can see. Why? Because so much of the internet is built on, so much of AI, rather, its data training set is built from the internet. And I don't know if you know this, but the internet is not a super Uh, it's not a place where there's a lot of thoughtfulness, kindness, diversity, inclusion. There are some deep pockets of racism, sexism, and even in copyrighted materials, even if you're training it on purely um, copyrighted nonfiction materials, there's still those materials often only represent a particular point of view, a particular perspective. This is why we often get technologies that don't work well for minority people. You've probably heard about different kinds of IR sensors and hand sensors that, or facial recognition technologies that don't work well for people with darker skin because they were invented by people with lighter skin who never thought about, well, what about? And there are not a lot of minority viewpoints, perspectives, opinions, knowledge represented in massive data sets. So, of course, there's going to be these trends to be biased and to display racism. This exists not just in like general everyday AI tools, it's in student facing and student school intended AI tools. So we need to think very, very carefully about how we're bringing in AI and what is it showing our students and what is it showing us? Is it showing us what the real situation is, or is it showing us a biased racist view of what it thinks, what it has found in its statistical models? So a lot of times I hear people talking about AI and we've got to bring AI into education. We have to. We're not being responsible if we don't bring AI into schools. And I think that there's a lot of red herrings. I think there's a lot of arguments that are just not true. Being against AI in schools is like being against sex ed. I heard somebody say this, and wow, no, that's absolutely not true. We absolutely need students to have strong, solid, reliable, correct information. That's what sex ed should be, giving them solid, strong, reliable, scientific information. AI does not do that. I mean, when we break it down, AI is not providing solid, reliable information. And also, it is not a life or death situation. Using AI is not something that's going to potentially impact the entire rest of your life, you know? So that's not a great argument. It's already out there. We have to prepare students to use it. Well, I don't know that we do. I think the purpose of schools is to help students become critical thinkers and to understand how to find information, how to be lifelong learners. AI completely undercuts the learning process, the thought process, critical thinking, memory. Using AI undercuts everything that schools stand for. And I think if we produce students who are critical thinkers and are lifelong learners, they're going to understand how to learn how to do things. We're trying to prepare students for a world that doesn't exist yet. So we can't necessarily prepare them for the world as it is. We need to prepare them with the thinking skills and the habits of mind that are going to let them continue to evolve and grow throughout the years and not just be ready for the world that we're looking at right now. Because 10 years from now, who knows what the world's going to look like? Sometimes we hear parents talk about, well, my bosses are making me use it at work, so why shouldn't my student use it? Well, your boss is probably making you use lots of tools that your kids aren't going to use in school. Just because adults are using something doesn't necessarily mean that kids should use it, that it's appropriate for students to use, that it's educationally beneficial. Is it something that at some point students should learn about? Absolutely. I'll talk more about that in a second. But we've got to think carefully because just because it exists in the world doesn't mean we need to bring it into schools. Other technologies are bad for the environment. You're not railing against those. Well, part of that is we probably didn't think a whole lot in the past about how these different technologies are impacting the environment and the world. And that's on us. That's our bad. We screwed up and we need to think about that. And just because we didn't think about it in the past doesn't mean we don't think about it going forward. And I think there are so many clear signs of how AI is having terrible environmental effects that we need to pay attention. We can't just turn a blind eye to this and say, well, okay, we screwed up in the past, we'll continue to screw up. No, we know better, we do better. So I am saying that we should not be using AI in schools. I don't think as professionals we should use it. I don't think as students or students should be using it. That doesn't mean that I think we just ignore AI completely. I think we absolutely 100% should be teaching technology literacy to our students. We can't ignore AI. It does exist. We must educate our students about it because they are going home and using it, even if they don't use it in school, even if we help them understand why it's not something that they should be using in school. A lot of kids are going to go home and use it. That's why we need to teach them about it. That's why we need to help them see this is not something that they should be investing in, either their time, their money, their effort, because it is going to undercut any kind of knowledge and learning. And that's not good. That's not okay. So that's why I think information literacy, just at its core, is a call to Luddism, if you really think about it. And since we are all about information literacy in school librarianship, we absolutely should be thinking as Luddites. And I think there's two key words when it comes to information literacy. I think it's context and perspective are two key words. And the thing is, a lot of times people say, well, context, just because you're right doesn't mean I'm wrong. And you've maybe seen this cartoon in the past where there's someone who says, oh, I'm looking at this and it says it's a 6. And this person's saying, no, look at it from over here. It's a 9. The thing is, just because I'm looking at it one way doesn't mean that the way you're looking at it is wrong. I could be wrong. I could be looking at this the wrong way. There is a context that this piece of information falls into. This number on the ground is part of a series. There's either a 5 and a 7 on either side, or there's an 8 and a 10 on either side. There's more to this picture. And so we've got to take in the context that this information is in. And we can't just say, well, my perspective is just as valid as your perspective, because it's not true. Because if we're not paying attention to the context, then an opinion is not an opinion. It's an incorrect piece of information. And that has to do also with perspective. How are we seeing things? How are we looking at this? I found this series of images a while back, and I love them because it starts with something simple. It starts with this cylinder, and it says, well, if I look at the cylinder from a particular perspective, it looks like a circle. And if I look at the cylinder from a different perspective, it looks like a rectangle or a square. But if I step back and I get a wider perspective on things and I take in the full context, then I start to see it's not one or the other. It's an entire thing by itself that is neither one nor the other, but contains elements of both. And usually the fact of the matter is, when we take that step back and we get a better perspective on things, when we step back and see the entire picture and see the full context and are able to consider where we're standing in relation to that context and what our perspective is, we can see that there are a lot of different ways that we can look at this thing. There's a lot of different elements that we might be able to pull out of it. But rather than focusing on just one of them, having a wide perspective helps us to see that there are a lot of different possibilities. And so we want lots of different perspectives. We want lots of different opinions, but we also need to think about what the context that perspective is being pulled from. So with that information literacy element, the context and perspective element, and when we start thinking about emerging technologies, we need to ask ourselves some questions like, how does this new technology situate in the big picture of education? How does this sort of fit in with what does the tool do and how does it do what it does? It's important for us to have at least some basic technology literacy about tools we want to bring into school. How does it do what it does? What kind of problem does this tool solve? And is it really a problem? Is this tool, the way it's built, the way it's used, is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it moral? I would argue for AI, the answer to all of those is no. We need to ask ourselves, is it safe for students to use? Does it have any kind of impacts on learning that our students are doing? Does it have impacts on the mental health of our students? Does it have impact on the environment? Is this tool, is this new emerging technology being pushed into schools by people who have vested interest in us using it? Or is it being pulled in by practitioners who see a value and want students to be able to take advantage of that value? These are questions we can ask ourselves that absolutely directly tie into our information literacy and technology literacy perspectives as school librarians. So we need to think about also information, because we are very much about information in our profession, and we need to recognize that information is not free. Information takes time to collect. It takes effort to collect and verify. It takes training to create reliably. We need to think about who's getting paid for the information. Are the information creators the ones who are receiving the benefit of the information they've shared, or is it information aggregators who are getting the benefit? Not the creators, but the people who've pulled the information together. We've seen that go on across the internet with news. And that's why we see a lot of news organizations being shut down, because information aggregators have pulled the information together. They're getting the benefit of advertising dollars and subscription monies. And the information creators are often left out in the cold and are not able to pay their bills. So we need to think about the information costs and recognize that information is not free. And AI also comes with costs. AI is a tool. All tools cost money to create. We should understand the costs of those tools before we decide if we're willing to pay. We need to understand not only the monetary cost, but any other costs that might exist. Now, the thing is, AI can absolutely do things that human beings can't. It is awesome at mining huge data sets that humans will never have time in hundreds of years to get through. And it can find connections and it can find statistical relationships. That's great. That's awesome. Should we allow AI to do that? Of course we should. That does not mean that it is useful in the average everyday school, in the average everyday classroom, in the K-12 school. I would argue it doesn't necessarily even have a place in postgrad, in secondary levels, in tertiary levels, in college levels. Maybe when you get into graduate work, that's where you start looking at AI, or maybe in college after you've had some basic background built up. But learning requires pedagogical friction. And I love this idea. Micah J. Miner introduced this idea to me, and I love it. Pedagogical friction. We learn when things are difficult. We learn the most, we learn the fastest when things are difficult, because difficult things stick with us. Our brain is wired to remember things that are hard for us to do. And so learning is all about having a certain degree of difficulty so that information sticks in our brains. Learning is built from struggle, and AI undercuts that. It undermines that pedagogical friction. And unfortunately, so many ed tech tools also undermine that pedagogical friction. And so I think that's part of the reason we're starting to see the pushback on technology generally in schools. But I haven't seen as much pushback on AI specifically. And I'm hoping people will think carefully about how this all plays into the educational process. Because when AI is removing that pedagogical friction, we as adults need pedagogical friction. We need to learn what works and what doesn't work with our students. We need to learn what lessons actually will be most beneficial for our students. And when we have AI creating these products for us, we are cutting out our own learning process. That's not good. We should be lifelong learners. And the fact of the matter is, when we have students use AI, when we use AI, AI actually is going to cost us more time than it saves. People say, oh, it's going to save so much time, it's going to save so much work. But the fact of the matter is, because AI does not know correct from incorrect, it only knows statistically relevant or average. When it spits out information, it creates information that sounds reliable. It puts words together that sound correct. But if we are not subject experts, we may not even recognize that what it has given us is incorrect information. So we actually have to go in and check carefully any products that AI pushes out to us. We need to fact check the information. We need to do deep dives into the knowledge. That fact checking takes time. It takes skills. We've got to teach people how to have those skills to fact check in the first place, and then they've got to apply them. Most people we know are kind of informationally lazy. They're not going to take the time to learn the skills or use those skills once they have those skills. And so that means AI is really undercutting a lot of what should be being used to help us verify that anything AI spits out is going to be correct. And the other thing is, AI is not very good at citing its sources. It's getting better, but it's still not great. And it still creates sometimes its own citations, which unless we look them up, unless we fact check, we're not getting that information. And in order to understand whether those citations are correct, people need to know, how does a citation work? Where should it be? How do I find the original sources? How do I read and understand those sources to see if the information that I'm being told came from that source, A, actually came from that source, and B, is being correctly used and or cited? Is it being taken out of context? Is it being reinterpreted? those are things we need to be aware of. And if we're using AI correctly, we are going to check those things. Doing all of this should go on with learning. It doesn't always go on with learning, but it should. And when we are taking that path, it's longer, it's slower, it's not as efficient, but it is a better learning process. It's better to learn and remember that information. So we've got to give some thought to, if we think AI is going to save us time, are we actually using it correctly? Because having somebody else do the work, you should be looking through that work very carefully to check and make sure it's correct, especially when you know that the thing that's doing the work for you is very often incorrect, confidently incorrect at that. So as educators, as guardians of information literacy, we need to think about our students. We need to think about how they are learning. We need to think about their safety. We need to think about how they are developing. We need to think about how tools that they are using are impacting them and the impact those tools are having not just on the students, but on the world those students are going to have to operate in. We also need to think about information. We need to think about how is information created? What is the quality of that information? What is the purpose of that information? How is that information being disseminated? These are all incredibly important elements of making sure that we're doing our job correctly. And AI really undercuts a lot of that. Personally, I think the SIFT method is a pretty decent method. There are better methods that are coming out and people are working on new ideas all the time. For the moment, I'm using SIFT to help me think about AI because I'm stopping to think, does what I have gotten, is it emotion forward? Is it trying to get me to feel something rather than, and react rather than learn? Does it fit with what I already know? This was one of the original problems with Wikipedia, that we used to tell students don't use Wikipedia because they don't have enough background knowledge to know if something is correct or incorrect. When they see it, especially when it's on a computer, interesting psychology fact, when we see something that's on a screen or computer, in the past, we have tended to think that's more correct than when somebody tells it to us. So that's also undercutting a bit of the learning process when we are getting stuff from AI. But we've also got to investigate the source. Where is the information coming from? AI is going to push it to us. Is it pushing the correct information? Where did AI get the information? Is there bias? Did they provide various perspectives? What's the source trying to sell? Is the source we're getting the information from, what's its perspective? What's it trying to get us to feel or do? Is it just there to provide information? And where did AI get it from? We need to find alternate coverage. So often what we see on the screen, especially with AI, students just assume that AI has given them the information they need, but where did that information come from? Can we find other sources that say the same thing? Lateral reading, looking to see what are some of the other sources out there on this topic, and are they saying the same kinds of things? Do reputable sources agree about the topic? We need to be able to trace claims, quotes, and media. We need to digitally detect, are the quotes that are being used, are the citations that are being used, are the media sources being used, are they real? Are they from actual sources? Are they from reliable sources? How did this come into play in the first place? What kind of citations are we provided with? Do we have experts or key witnesses that are providing the original source of information? And are those sources being accurately reported? So that's a lot of stuff. And when we start pulling it all together, I think it's incredibly important that we acknowledge that we cannot ignore AI, but we also don't have to just blindly use it. We can be knowledgeable about AI. We can be aware. We should be aware. We can think about capabilities of what AI can do and what other tech tools can do. We can think about the use cases for those tools and technologies. We can think about the costs versus the benefits and do that calculation. We don't have to take the bait. We don't have to just swallow whole, somebody said we should use this and so we're going to use it. We don't have to swallow whole that somebody said this exists in the world and so we have to bring it into school. Because guess what? There's a lot of stuff that exists in the world that we don't bring into schools. And there's a reason for that. So we've got to think carefully about, are we educating our students? We need to educate ourselves, we need to educate our peers, and we need to educate our students about what AI does, what AI doesn't do. We need to let our administrators know what AI does. We need to let our school boards and our parents be more aware. We need to help them understand that yes, this is a tool that exists, but Here are reasons we need to be very careful with its application in our schools. We should only use ed tech, whatever kind of ed tech that is, whether it's AI or something else. We should only use ed tech tools that reduce exclusionary friction, things that make it harder to learn. We should be focusing on and helping to create productive friction, things that help information land deeply in our brains, help us learn. So, yes, absolutely. AI can reduce some exclusionary frictions, but we need to be very careful when we use it that way, because it also is not necessarily reliable or accurate. It can be biased, it can be racist. So we need to think carefully about these tools. Yes, we want to reduce exclusionary learning frictions, but we also need to preserve productive learning frictions. So it's a lot. All of the information in the slide deck has links. All the different headlines that popped up have links to the original stories. So you are more than welcome to come in. If you have more questions about my thoughts on this, I'm not an expert. I am self-trained in all of this. I have just tried to follow the breadcrumbs as they pop up. I try to keep, abreast of what's going on in technology generally because I find it interesting. But AI in particular has really gotten under my skin as something that I worry a lot about as we see more and more people using it on a day-to-day basis without, I think, a strong understanding of the drawbacks that it brings. So if you have questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about school librarianship. I love talking about the pros and cons of educational technology. I am happy to talk about more AI stuff. I don't know if you noticed, but in the background of all the slides, there's actually a picture of Luddites with hammers smashing presses, smashing a loom. So this is an old print, and I thought it was kind of appropriate. There's lots of great cartoons out there about AI and ed tech, and we should think sometimes they have some real deep truths hidden inside of their funniness. But you are welcome to view these slides, and like I said, you are welcome to use these slides, reuse these slides, remix these slides. Whatever's going to help you share with others, whatever's going to help you get people to think deeply about this very important issue. So thank you so much. Hopefully we will be able to chat more about this in the future, but at the very least, I hope I've given you something to think about, and I should do a book break.
Book break. Squiddy.
So let's book break it. I'm going to toss out there. I just read a book called Too Old for This, and I'll put the author in the show notes, but it is about an elderly woman who was accused when she was a younger woman of being a serial killer, and she was not convicted, and she's now elderly and living her life, and she lives in this small town, and her past comes back to haunt her in some real interesting ways. So this is not a book for students. This is a book for adults. It is a fun book. It is interesting. It is not a happy-go-lucky book, but it is an interesting look into a very clever brain, one that is aware that it is starting to slow down and fail. It's a really interesting look at being elderly and just sort of thinking about our own abilities and mortalities, which was something I really appreciated as someone who is seeing that happening more and more with people in my life. So that was interesting and it was good. I also just read a book called Pushing Ice by Alistair Reynolds, whose works have been suggested to me multiple times in the past. I'm a sci-fi geek, and this is a sci-fi story about what would happen if in 20 or 30 years from now, we've got a crew out in space that's trying to mine asteroids, and they find themselves basically reluctantly pulled along in the wake of an interstellar object that goes so fast it causes time dilation, because as you go faster, time for you seems to continue at a regular pace, but people watching, it would look like time slows down for us, or if we were watching other people outside of this time dilation, it looks like time speeds up for them. So this crew finds themselves on a journey that separates them not only in space, but also in time from the worlds and the peoples that they know. And it's, I really enjoyed it. It was a real fun book. It's got some real interesting twists and turns to it. And it's very much about the people in the story, but it's also got some interesting sort of science worked into it. So anyway, those are a couple of books if you're looking for some book recs. Yeah. And so that's, I think, all we've got for today. Hopefully, there's something here to get you to think. Hopefully, there's something here that you can enjoy as you read. At the very least, hopefully, there's something here that gave you a laugh. So be safe, be well. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the SLLN podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for the episode. They feature links to resources shared by our guest, as well as ways to keep in touch with them, and links to the book break titles. I'd love to hear from you. If you have feedback, a comment, an idea, a question, or something you want to share, you can email drtlovesbooks@gmail.com. That's drtlovesbooks@gmail.com. Know a librarian with something we could learn from? Let us know. Until next time, be good, be safe, and be well.